Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Perry channel, where we typically go through the LDS Truth Claim series. A little bit of behind the scenes on this week. I recorded a version of the Lehi in Jerusalem video. I'm not very satisfied with how that video turned out, and so it's kind of going back to scripting to make sure that we can deliver the usual analysis, the usual quality of analysis to you. I feel that particular line of argument deserves a little bit better argumentation than what I was able to present, mostly due to some time constraints and some other events that were going on, just kind of in daily life at this point. Um, those circumstances are cleared up, and so I don't expect any further problems with moving forward through the series. Uh, but it just happened to kind of be this confluence of circumstances that came together to get in the way of making that video turn out the way I really wanted it to. So in lieu of that, this week we had the release of American Primeval on Netflix. I figured that I'd like to talk a little bit about Mormonism in media, especially in light of that particular series. It struck a particular nerve of annoyance that I haven't really felt with portrayals of Mormonism in media since I don't know that I've seen quite as egregious an example of something so particular in Mormon history being treated with such reckless abandon, for lack of a better term. The term, or that the events of the Mountain Meadows Massacre and the Utah Mormon War were used as a backdrop, but without real deference to the actual history. And this is kind of coming in this moment of Mormonism in media. We've had the Murder Among the Mormons series that dealt with the Mark Hoffman bombings, Under the Banner of Heaven, which talks about the Lafferty brothers. We have the documentary series Keep Sweet, Pray, and Obey that deals with the FLES movement and Warren Jeffs and all of the the crimes that have gone on with that particular branch of the broader restoration movement. Um, but American Primeval just kind of dealing with that with a particularly dark period in Mormon history. Um, I suppose I would have hoped for a better treatment of that event and the history around that event. I mean, there are just things even within the show itself that end up contradicting what they put forward on the screen. So it's not like it. I mean, they seem to be taking this intent to fictionalize what happened in the history, and that's fine. If you're going to take certain events and be inspired by history and then fictionalize the events, but remain sort of historically authentic, I'm okay with that. But there's the whole letter by the colonel of the army who writes that the massacre happened on September 7th. The actual massacre happened on September 11th of 1857, which is okay to change the dates, but everything about the setting of the show sets events where it's cold and it's dangerous to travel west, and all that is very well established as influencing the plot of the show. Are you doing okay? Um, Forgive the dog. Um, the This is just a contradiction within the series, and it it could have used the actual historical elements better if they wanted to get so close to the historical events. And with that too, just the portrayal of Mormonism in the show. They wanted, I guess, the Mormons to be sort of these religious zealots and these villains, pretty one note and flat. And I didn't really care for that portrayal. It didn't really capture the complexities and the challenges that were going on. It refers a lot to, the perceived threats that were coming from the U.S. government at the time, which is fine. That's actually pretty authentic to what was going on in Utah and a lot of the concerns and the paranoia that was going on among the Mormons there. But it at the same time doesn't really give depth to the complexity of life in Utah. It just paints this. I and the Mormon Stories episode with the historians talking about this. They make the mention that it just kind of portrays them as like these like Puritans living out in the wilderness, and that actually I think is a pretty fair characterization of how Mormons are portrayed in that series. Um, all in all, as a show, as a series, I tried to kind of judge it based off of that as much as possible and to kind of keep some of the historical issues out of kind of my feelings on the series, as well as trying to to talk about the historical issues kind of as a separate matter. But I don't know. I found that it missed the mark in terms of historical accuracy, obviously, but even when it tried to tell the story, its own story as a series, I found it to be unbalanced. And this is really in contrast to some of the other stuff that I've seen bringing Mormonism into media. So, Under the Banner of Heaven, also very critical. And controversial for some of the things that it portrayed. But at the same time, when it did get into history, it at least seemed more authentic to the history, even if certain specifics were historically inaccurate. It at least had a certain authenticity to the early church history. And there are criticisms to lobby about how it portrayed, like the story of the Laffertys and all of that. And all those criticisms are completely fair to how that series portrayed those events. And it's even fair to offer criticisms to how it portrayed early Mormonism, but I felt that they did a better job in at least being authentic to early Mormon history there than American Primeval did. And I don't know, I'm also frustrated because this event, I mean, when historical stories are told in media, you put a lot of money and investment into that. You kind of get the one opportunity every 10 to 20 years or so to tell those kinds of stories. And so we're probably another 10 or 20 years out now because of American Primeval from being able to tell an authentic version of the story of Mountain Meadows. And yeah, I'm pretty disappointed about it on that front. There's also the ways that the Bear River Massacre was handled, and uh, I'm sort of new to that story as well. The discourse around this show introduced me to the story of the Bear River Massacre. And just kudos to Darren Perry for getting onto Mormon stories as well and for talking about what the series has done well in starting that dialogue, but also what it missed and how it really flattened that story and the role that that played in the development of the colonization of Cache Valley. Um, as well as like a lot of the displacement that happened to the people who are indigenous to those lands. I've said before too, I mean not on this series, but to those who know me, that I would really love to see a sort of big budget portrayal from a non-Mormon perspective, just somebody taking the history of Joseph Smith and early Mormonism. And I would really love to see that done in a way that still retains a certain openness to a faithful, believing perspective. But after seeing American Primeval handle Mount Meadows and the Utah Mormon War the way that it did, I, I feel like I've lost a lot of trust in the ability of non-Mormon directors, non-Mormon producers to really authentically, genuinely tell that story in a meaningful way and in a way that's true and honest to the story overall. I don't particularly like the squeaky clean image that the church puts forward in Prophet of the Restoration and projects like that. But I think that if it's something like American Primeval was done that really flattens out the characters, that makes, I mean, if they took like basically the treatment that they did to Brigham Young in that series and applied it to Joseph Smith, I think that that would be a just as bad representation in sort of the opposite direction of the character of Joseph Smith. I think Joseph is a much more nuanced and interesting character. The more that you learn about him, the more that you study Mormon history, the more interesting and sort of captivating that that character becomes. And some of that complexity is part of the reason why people who become disaffected with the faith have such strong emotions about Joseph and sort of the image that it was they claim was portrayed to them in their upbringing versus the image that is actually like borne out in the historical record. And there are others still who do learn about that complexity and yet still remain faithful because of just how complex and interesting and nuanced and multifaceted the character of Joseph Smith really is. Um, yeah, I think that if just this flattening of characters, this creating of sort of a one note, one dimensional. John Dehlin talks about Brigham Young coming across as a mob boss. I don't know that I necessarily saw him that way in the show. Really, more as just kind of a flat religious zealot. Um, yeah, I think that Brigham is much more interesting than that. The series also brings up a lot with polygamy, and of course it does. This is the hot, sexy topic to talk about when you're talking about early Mormonism. But there's no actual portrayal of the Mormon practice of polygamy and what that meant for the people. We're not shown any of like actual like Mormon civilization. There's nothing that's shown with like the Salt Lake or any of these other cities, and everything is just very wild and all that. And that's, I guess, fine. In and of itself, it's not necessarily a problem. But when we're talking about like the Mormons being afraid of what the army is going to bring down upon them, and that being a strong impetus for the things that they're doing and the reasons why they're taking the actions they're taking, not showing what they feel that they have to defend, what they have to fight for, I think is a missed opportunity, a mistake to really explain a lot of the nuance of what's going on there. And I just kind of fear that if they were to try to do something that's even more sensitive to Mormon history, specifically like the story of Joseph Smith and really early Mormonism, that they would end up doing the same thing and just really dropping the ball and all of that. And that's disappointing. I would have hoped. I was actually really excited for the series when I heard what it was about, what it was going to be dealing with. And it ended up being, for me, a pretty significant disappointment. And that's despite the fact that there are some very good performances in it. The Jim Bridges was or Bridger was just an excellent like character. The performance by the actor who plays him was solid throughout. Uh, and I actually think that as far as the way that they handled his character and the story of Fort Bridger was fantastic. Like I actually like as far as an adaptation of history, that's kind of how you do it with keeping things historically authentic, even if you're moving events around. That's how you do it. But the way that like Mountain Meadows was handled was, I think they completely missed the mark of how that story should be told. And I think that if you're going to tell that story, that you should be closer to the actual authentic history. And this series just didn't seem interested with that. And now that's going to get in the way of actually authentically telling that story. And I'm pretty displeased with that. We've had other shows or films, shows that have come up, and some have been controversial, some have been maybe a little bit less so. Uh, we've had just in this last year, The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, which is this reality series. We've had Heretic, which it takes sort of Mormonism but puts it into a horror film. And like those can be valuable or not, or controversial in their own ways, but they're not trying to necessarily do what American Primeval ostensibly is trying to do. And I think that those sorts of stories, it's a little bit safer to move away. I mean, Secret Lives of Mormon Wives is what it is, but something like Heretic is safer in kind of moving away from telling a true story or something that people might have actually experienced because of the nature of the story that it's trying to tell. But with something like American Primeval, yeah, moving away from it the way that they did, I think was rather irresponsible. That said, if it is starting the dialogue, if it is having the conversation going about like the actual history of these events, that's great. But at the same time, I think that it puts forward an image of Mormonism that just is not, it's not something that I'd like to see on media. And that's somebody, as somebody who's pretty critical of the movement, right? I mean, my series on addressing LDS truth claims is not necessarily friendly to the specific claims that are being put forward. And but at the same time, like I don't want criticism to be lobbed against the church, against the religion that is unwarranted. And there's plenty of criticism to bring forward in the story of Mountain Meadows and everything that's surrounded in the Utah War and all those events. Like there's plenty to tell, but the story that the series tried to tell ended up being sensationalized in a counterproductive way, but also in a way that was, I think, less impactful than the actual history. And that's just a weird position to put it in. This is going to be people's first, for a lot of people, this will be their first exposure to the story of the Utah Mormon War and of Mountain Meadows and, I guess in my case, of the Bear River Massacre. And to have it told in this way, it seems unfair to introduce the public to it in this way, where now they have to unlearn a whole lot of things that were portrayed in the series when this is their first exposure. And it seems irresponsible as well. I think that the filmmakers would have been better off if they wanted to keep Fort Bridger in the story and all that, that's fine, but they should have moved further away from the actual authentic history and not made it seem as though they were trying to tell historical events. Remove references to the Meadows, remove references to the Mormon Reformation. And to yeah, I think that moving away from those particular ideas would have been much more responsible. And I think about like a series like Shogun, which is telling a story under the Japanese shogunate, but it's kind of in a nebulous space. It's not really trying to tell like a specific historical story. It's clearly based off of a historical fiction novel. Like it's telling it's painting a particular portrait that is attempting to be historically authentic, but is not going for any degree of historical accuracy. And if that's what they wanted to do, that's what they should have done. But instead, they tried to put on the trappings of historical accuracy to a certain extent in order to sort of like legitimize the story. But it just I came across to me as being pretty irresponsible. And I think that it really undercut the value of the series. And then because of those inaccuracies, it ends up kind of creating like internal problems with the show storytelling if you're paying attention. Um, and yeah, that was really kind of how I felt about that and how Mormonism in media is developing. It's pretty sad, in my opinion, that Trey Parker and Matt Stone, who have spent more time criticizing or at least presenting like a satirical view of Mormonism, are still some of the most like authentic or accurate non-Mormon media creators who are putting out content about Mormonism. And whether or not you like what they're putting forward is a separate discussion, but at least they're pretty darn accurate to the tradition overall and to the culture, and they have an understanding of it, and they're satirical. And to not see like a similar level of responsibility taken in a series like American Primeval is just greatly disappointing. And especially since it's going to get in the way of better portrayals in the future of those even being funded. And it's not necessary. I mean, the show was number one on Netflix for a pretty short time. It's now dropped down into number two, it looks like, and it may bounce back and forth a little bit. But it's not really clear how well the show is actually going to do. It has good audience score ratings, but it got hit pretty hard by the critical reviews, and I think that that's actually I'd land closer to where the critics were than to where the overall audience is with response to that series. And if that just gets in the way of funding future stories about early Mormonism, then that sucks. This was an opportunity. This was a good opportunity with funding and with the backing of Netflix, and to have like this global distribution of a show talking about early Mormonism. And I think they really dropped the ball in the way that they did that, and that's really just disappointing to me. Anyway, that's all I really want to say on this. I know this is very off the cuff, and yeah, I appreciate it if you stuck around for my ramblings. If this sort of like commentary on these sorts of projects is interesting to you, if you enjoy this as much more than sort of the Answering LDS Truth Claim series, let me know. I would be interested maybe in doing the one-offs every once in a while with this sort of thing. The primary purpose of this channel at this point is to address the LDS Truth Claim series. I just didn't want to have YouTube drop this off from people who drop that series off from people who might see it otherwise because of a gap in the release order. And again, Lehi in Jerusalem is coming. Expect that next week at the usual release time. And I'll see you then. Thank you so much. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe if you enjoyed this. Uh, do the sharing if that is of interest to you. Doing all the various YouTube things. Follow me on Blue Sky as well. The link to that, the handle to that, is down in the description. And otherwise, I will see you next week when we will finally get to Lehi in Jerusalem. Thank you all so much. We'll see you then. Bye.